I'm Ted Seides, and this is Capital Allocators. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind capital allocation. Through conversations with leaders in the money game, we learn how these holders of the keys to the kingdom allocate their time and their capital. You can join our mailing list and access premium content at capitalallocators.com.
All opinions expressed by Ted and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Capital Allocators or their firms. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of Capital Allocators or podcast guests may maintain positions in securities discussed on this podcast.
My guests on today's show are Roz Hewsenian and Joshua Fenton. Josh is the Chief Investment Officer of the Leona M and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust, an $8 billion pool he began leading earlier this year upon the retirement of Roz, who served as CIO for the prior 12 years. Roz was a past guest on the show, and that conversation is replayed in the feed. Our conversation follows last week's about succession, using the live example of a successful CIO transition. We discuss Roz's plan for her retirement, steps to evaluate and train her successor, and actions upon her retirement announcement 18 months beforehand. We also cover the transition from Josh's perspective, including what happened along the way, conversations that took place, and changes when he took over as CIO. Lastly, Josh and Roz share lessons others can apply for transitions in both allocator and manager organizations. Before we get going, here's a shout out to all the investor relations and business development professionals. Your role is one of the toughest in the industry because unlike in many other industries, the functions of marketing, sales, and customer relations rarely drive purchase decisions in investing. It's often hard to know how to move the ball forward when allocators are busy and opaque about their process. So we decided to create a Capital Allocators University experience just for you. On December 3rd and 4th in New York City, I'll be joined by your peer and superstar Rahul Mudgal, branding expert Jen Prosek, founder of Prosek Partners, conference wizard Ron Biscardi, founder of iConnections, and investment leaders Sarah Samuels from NEPC, Dave Moorhead from Baylor, and Shannon O'Leary from St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation, to help you learn best practices for understanding allocators, developing relationships with investors, and building a brand through workshops and peer discussions. You can learn more and sign up to join us at capitalallocators.com/university. Thanks so much for spreading the word about our newest Capital Allocators University course for investor relations and business development professionals. Please enjoy my conversation with Roz Hewsenian and Josh Fenton.
Roz, Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited to be here, Ted.
So, Roz, we're going to talk a bunch about this transition that you two went through together. And maybe the way to start is in your 13-year tenure at Helmsley, at what point in time did you start thinking about that you would no longer be the CIO?
It actually started with the simple question, which was, what happens if I got hit by a bus? The concern was who would take over if that was the case to make sure that the department ran smoothly. The way that I was staffed is that we had 4 directors of investments, each with their area of expertise, but all of whom were senior investment professionals. And I decided that any one of the 4 of them should be able to step in the event that something happened to me. So the way that I managed the department was to be quite open with the team about the things that I did that were not necessarily investment related, but were related to my responsibilities as the department head and the CIO, most of which had nothing to do with investments, didn't necessarily affect them, but clearly if they needed to step in for me, it was important that they understood these things. Also, during my tenure at Helmsley, I reported to 4 different people in those nearly 14 years. So there was a lot of turnover over me, and it was important to maintain stability below me. I always thought in terms of making sure that the team was aware of everything that was going on. As time went on, I had always known my retirement date. I'd picked it actually in the beginning of my career in a group meeting of new employees at my first job out of business school at Kraft General Foods, where the HR director who was addressing us said, "You should decide today what your retirement date is and start planning for it now." And we were all in our 20s, and I thought, okay, I'm an obedient person. I'll do as I'm told, and I picked my retirement date. About 5 years before I actually retired, I began thinking, I really need to make sure that there is a good transition in place, because around us, CIOs were leaving their jobs without a transition, and the teams below them would leave in anticipation of a new boss coming in over them, and they wanted to take matters into their own hands rather than just wait for fate to dictate what would happen to them. So of the 4 directors that I had, any one of the 4 could have succeeded me, but I thought that Joshua had the best chance of acceptance by the trustees, by the investment committee. And so I began focusing on him 5 years ago. And the way that I did it is that I would walk into his office and I would sit down and I would tell him things. I never told him that he was my pick. I just started telling him things that I thought that he should know. And we would have these great conversations. They weren't planned. It was very informal. And I was putting in his head things that he would need to know if he were ever to succeed me, number one. And number two, be aware of the environment outside of our department, because that's the environment in which he would have to operate.
What are some examples of some of those things that you tried to show Joshua and the other 3 deputies that they might not have seen in the normal course of their jobs?
I would talk to them about things that are going on in larger Helmsley, about some of the pressure points, some of the difficulties that occurred that I was involved in one way or another. It wouldn't directly affect my staff, but it was part of my job. And that had to do with being a senior member of the organization and helping to run the organization. So it was those sorts of things that were internal to the Helmsley operating that I brought to their attention.
What were some of your favorite examples of one of those?
I had 4 bosses, so I would share with the team things that were going on as a result of the turnover of the bosses, the CEOs, what some of the pressure points were, what I was getting involved with, how I was part of the interview process for the successor, making sure that they understood that we were looking for somebody who could manage the entire organization. Some of that turnover was not as smooth as we would have liked it to have been. And so therefore, sharing with the team the pressure points about that and how I was handling it, I felt would be instructive for them. They would listen very carefully and very patiently. And I felt it was important for them to understand not only what was happening, but sometimes I'd come back from a meeting and I didn't exactly have a smile on my face. And I felt it was important for them to understand why.
So Josh, what was this like from your perspective? If you go back to that 5-year period before Roz retired, when did you start to notice some of these conversations that she was bringing to the fore?
Biggest indicator that this idea was bubbling in Roz's head was intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes there are misunderstandings among a staff about who is working on what project or how something should be presented, what should be prioritized. And these can create little moments on the staff that they're not unfriendly, but they're just little disagreements. And I think Roz started putting me in the position to think about how to resolve some of these, how to approach what was going on, and think of my role as helping the team work together and gel together really efficiently across lots of different roles on the team. Where before, as a director of investments, I was really very focused on portfolio implementation and finding managers. And so my purview slowly expanded to just being a little bit more aware of what managing a group of people who are all contributing to the greater whole, how that might be a different focus or something I had to be a little bit more aware of. And it's clearly the most important part of my job now. So I'm glad I got a little taste of that. It was not a deliberate thing where Roz came in and said, you need to be aware that this is something you have to learn how to handle. She just sort of gave me little pieces of it at a time. And that was a really constructive way for me to become aware of what would become a really important part of this role.
What were one of those first pieces that you remember having to take a different perspective on?
Sometimes on a team, there are new things that crop up, new events, new projects, and there needs to be some clarity on who's going to be handling it and who's going to be assembling the final pitch to the team about how to handle it. And no team can be 100% clear on new things about who's going to do it. And so I think some of that early stuff was just getting the group together and finding out who really wanted to do it, who thought this was an opportunity for them, trying to think about who on the team could professionally benefit from stretching to try something new. I think that was something that Roz always was very good about doing for me. Basically, this is something that you probably need to learn how to do a little bit better, get some more practice. So why don't you try to do this? Why don't you send this particular email to this manager telling them what we're concerned about? Why don't you write it? I'll take a look at it. And so I started thinking about how to hand off those kinds of tasks to other people on the team in a way that would sort of balance their strengths and maybe develop some of their weaknesses. And I think that's another thing that's really important as a CIO is to give your team members the opportunities to grow professionally without dropping problems in their lap, being incremental about it.
One of the things, Ted, that I think it's important to understand about Helmsley is that the team is set up not in buckets or lanes or categories. We give a lot of latitude to the staff to work on a lot of different projects. In doing so, it keeps them interested and motivated because they're always looking at new and different things. That's both a benefit, but it creates a bigger management challenge. And that's why everything that Joshua just said was so important. An opportunity would come up to work on a particular project, and it took management skill to make sure it didn't become a jump ball. And that's what Joshua is referring to, how to manage those sensitivities within the team.
Roz, as you started thinking about dripping these different leadership and management responsibilities onto Joshua and the other senior people, the goal is continuity, and that's worked out. How did you manage 4 different potential successors when ultimately there's only going to be one seat?
I had a very good understanding of each of the 4 directors, and any one of the 4 could have succeeded me in taking over. I spent a lot of time going into their offices, sitting down and talking with them about all kinds of things, not just work-related. Sometimes there were things outside of the office. I was looking at temperament. I was looking at their interests. I was looking at how they think about problems. I was thinking about the fact that we had younger members of the team who are very, very different from each other. Who could be the most malleable in their management style to deal with each of those different people and what they needed? Those were some of the things that I was considering and doing it in a way that I was trying not to let on to anybody what I was doing. I mean, that was the part that was most important. But I think it's also important to know that when the rubber needed to meet the road, I did sit down with everybody on the team, including people who would not be my successor. And I had a heart-to-heart talk with everybody about that I was going to step down, what I wanted to propose to the trustees, and how they felt about it. And I gave them a lot of time to think about it. I informed Helmsley 18 months in advance of my leaving, and that gave plenty of time for people to get used to the idea and used to the transition. It was the communication and the open and frank discussion with everybody that I think made the difference. I was willing to listen to whatever they had to say, and they were willing to listen to me. That can only happen when you have a strong relationship with everybody on your staff.
When you got within that 18-month period and you had announced your pending retirement, how did you sequence the conversations that you wanted to have, both internally with the team and with the governance board?
Well, what happened is that the matter, in effect, was taken out of my hands. 18 months before I retired, I was in a trustees meeting giving them an investment update, and the news was not good because the markets weren't good. Inflation had finally taken hold, interest rates had started rising, and the market started rolling over. In the middle of my presentation, one of the trustees just stopped me and looked at me and said, "You can't retire. Are you going to retire? When are you going to retire?" And I thought to myself, okay, I have a decision to make here on the fly. I could either play this off or I could tell him straight out that I actually had a retirement date. And so I decided to be honest with them, and I said, well, I am going to retire in December of 2023. So when I told them that I actually had a retirement date, even though it was 18 months in advance, they were shocked. And I said to them, look, I was going to tell you in January. I said, so what I want everybody to do is to just absorb the information and think about it. I also want to talk to my staff. And I said, I have a transition plan in place. And of course, they immediately wanted to know what it was. And I said, well, I haven't talked to anybody about it yet. Would you please give me a day? And so they gave me a day, and I left the meeting, and I go running into Josh's office, and I sat down and I looked at him and I said, you and I have been playing this dance about whether you would really be interested in succeeding me if I were to step down. And I explained to him what happened in the meeting, and I said, so now the rubber has to meet the road. I'm asking you straight out, Josh, do you definitely want to succeed me? Because we have to go down this path. And he looked at me and he said resoundingly, yes, I do. And so I went back to the trustees and I told them what my transition plan was and how I intended to manage it. And their immediate reaction was, well, we're appointing you to the investment committee. This is the committee I reported to for the last nearly 14 years. And that stopped me cold because I thought to myself, how would my successor feel knowing that I'd be appointed to the investment committee? It effectively would look like he would still end up reporting to me. So I was quite concerned about that. And I went back to Josh and we had quite a few conversations about it. And then I went about talking to the other directors and talking to everybody else on the team and explaining to them what was going to happen. I told them what the proposal was for my successor. I told everybody to think about it. And I told them that I wanted to have their reaction to it, positive, negative, whatever it was, because I wanted everybody to feel comfortable. So Josh and I both had to digest this idea of my being appointed to the investment committee. And I explained to the team that that was something that the trustees had asked that I do. And everybody's jaw dropped because it's not common. But we all had 18 months to get used to the idea. People came back to me with questions and comments, and we discussed them. If it was something that I felt I needed to discuss with Joshua, I did. 9 times out of 10, there was a very good answer for people's concerns. And Joshua had an opportunity to watch how I managed. And while he certainly would be different, I think some of the underlying tenets were the same. Open door policy. Let people come and talk to you whenever they felt the need to do so. Be open and honest about what's going on. Those basic management style issues, I think, he's maintained, and that's what has ensured that the transition was so smooth. Then we get to the first investment committee meeting where for the first time I'm sitting at the opposite side of the table. And It was strange. It was very weird. So I asked the chairman, Linda Strump, for a moment of personal privilege. She granted it, and I just acknowledged the elephant in the room, that this was going to be weird, but we'll all just get through it. And I was very proud of the team. They handled themselves fantastically well. I was sitting there not only just as an investment committee member, but as their cheerleader.
Roz, how do you think about going directly onto the committee compared to leaving a year gap before coming back onto the committee?
First of all, I wasn't given a choice. But second of all, I think ideally that would be the best way to do it, because it gives the successor the opportunity to get his or her sea legs under them without necessarily the scrutiny of sitting there in front of your boss. One of the things I was concerned about is that the team would be reticent to bring forward a recommendation that they think I personally wouldn't like. And I had to come to grips with the fact that I wasn't the CIO anymore. My job wasn't to approve or disapprove. My job was to ensure that all the policies and the procedures that Helmsley had were adhered to, test conviction, and ensure that due diligence was appropriately undertaken. The team is compensated through an incentive comp plan, and they had to live or die by their own decision making. And I had to respect that. So we all had to be disciplined in our new roles, and that's what it meant.
Josh, going back to that 18-month window, it's hard to imagine among you and the three peers at the time that there wasn't some type of water cooler chat at some point in time about this whole process.
Yeah, was there?
No, there really wasn't. I think there was a pretty comfortable adjustment to the situation. So I don't want to go further than that and try and pretend I know what they were all thinking. But I didn't get any feeling from anyone on the team that there was any kind of sour grapes or concern about the transition at all. I really didn't. And I feel like the way the team has risen to a very quick challenge in 2024 really confirms that there really wasn't a lot of potential doubt in what was happening at that moment.
Once that announcement got made, at least internally, that you would be succeeding Roz, I'm curious what kind of conversations you had with those who had been your peers that now would be part of your team.
So one thing that had been really drilled into me by watching Roz be CIO for her tenure was to really reach out to your team and find out what they want to do and where they want to grow. And so it was really, really clear that that was an important step to take before Roz left the building, so to speak. So those are the conversations that I had with everyone. We are making some incremental tweaks to what people are actually doing in their roles now because of those conversations. And so I think that was something that gave everyone just comfort that I wasn't going to increase or create rigidity in the functions of the department that weren't there before. I was going to go out of my way to give everyone opportunities to do different things or follow their noses wherever those noses would go. I came from the buy side where it's very common to present an investment idea up the channel and get a hard no, and you just got to move on. But in the asset allocator space, especially when you're managing a generalist team, you can't just say no to the first pitch. You've got to ask questions about where they think this might go and then let them keep going. That's an adjustment that I've had to make just moving to the asset allocator side intellectually, where I came from a world where you got to know and you moved on because there was always another investment idea you could find somewhere. But this approach of letting people really look for truffles and give them some time to really dig in really paid off.
Josh, before you joined Helmsley, a dozen years before, you spent a lot of time in the direct investment world. What did you see as similar or different in your, say, last 12 years before taking over CIO from those experiences in the direct side?
What I really noticed right away when I joined Helmsley and started interviewing managers, and obviously I had been on the other side of the table pitching long-only public equity strategies, it almost became funny that I've been hearing this language given back to me, that I know how it was crafted, how it was created. I was part of building these slides. I call it the dreaded funnel every investment manager has. Well, this is our universe, and this is how we narrow it down. And it was almost comical to be on the other side and hear this pitch that I know was just, I wouldn't say it was phony, but it was just so managed. And I felt like my experience being a director of research and an analyst a long time ago, before that, you can really ask questions about the process of security selection and research within a team much more effectively and bluntly, having been in that chair and then having been called in for the big pitch meeting to the pension fund and say, well, this is how we're going to talk about this, and this is how we're going to talk about this. And it's not exactly the way you're doing things, because there's a lot of scratches and dents to managing money. And those are not the things that you present to clients or potential clients. So that nuance between the shiny new car and maybe some of the scratch and dents that you're not talking about, I really enjoyed jumping into those scratches and dents with the managers right off the bat and looking at the expression on their faces and saying, how do you know we do it that way?
What are a couple of little examples of that?
Well, a lot of managers talk about a very disciplined process and the 5 factors of security selection that they evaluate. And I know it's a lot squishier than that all the time. Maybe 20% of the ideas fit into this lovely definition of what you're looking for, but you can't limit yourself to that or you won't be able to build a portfolio. So there's a lot of behind the scenes scrubbing of how what you're looking at fits into what you're trying to do, making sure it makes sense from some of a larger attribution perspective. But a lot of the pieces end up not really fitting into the exact category that you're claiming is what you're doing. Or at least the process is a little rougher than the linear process that you put in the slide deck.
Knowing that's how it works behind the scenes on the other side of the table, how do you think about trying to find the very few managers that fill their portfolio with all the things that check the box compared to the most that you saw where it's kind of squishy in terms of what you're trying to find for Helmsley?
I think it's really important that managers understand and be aware of what they're really doing, and to break that wall a little bit in the conversation early in the relationship. And one of the ways to do that is by asking details about investment examples and then flipping back to the generic slide deck. You can generally find inconsistencies, and you want a manager who's going to not feel like you just called them out and get really defensive. You want them who's going to acknowledge that the process is a very unspecific process. It's a very go where your nose leads process. You have to be adaptive. You have to be flexible. And managers that try and pretend that they're not being flexible or not being adaptive, I think that comes across as less sincere.
How do you think about when you came across the other side of the table with deep domain expertise in one style of equity investing, the various other asset classes you got exposed to, and how you thought about asking those good questions when you might not have had as nuanced of an understanding of how those strategies work?
When a strategy seems complicated or is not something where you have full transparency, like some kind of quantitative strategy, it always helps to go right down to individual investment examples and really dig into, why did this pop up on your radar screen? How did you decide who to assign to do the work on this? What was their initial reaction that was different from the eventual conclusion? And really, by asking those kinds of questions, you can really dig into the process. And I think it's important when you're evaluating a manager to really isolate who's making the decision, who is really getting to the real crux of, this is a really good idea, this is an okay idea, this is a bad idea. Is it one person who always comes out with that decision? Or is there some depth on the team where those decisions can be made a little bit earlier before they filter all the way up to actual competing for portfolio positions? And I think understanding that nuance within a manager, there's no right or wrong answer, but you have to understand that nuance within how a manager builds a portfolio to really understand what you can expect from the manager when you actually invest with them.
Roz, I'd love to turn back to you and ask you a little about your evaluation of Joshua and the others on the team as you went through this process. Not everyone had that in-depth direct investing experience before they joined you that Joshua did. I'm curious how you saw that as an advantage or where some of the other aspects of that were either beneficial or different from some of the other people on the team.
The other three all came from money managers and had that similar sort of background in different categories. One was a strategist making investment decisions at more of a macro level. One was also managing money at a major money management firm. One came out of a hedge fund and had handled risk and investments there. So they all had direct investment experience, but they also had specializations. So one of the things that I was looking for is who could step out of their primary area of comfort and generalize across the entire portfolio. Could people be expert in all the other areas as well? Would they be able to know what kinds of questions to ask to probe the degree of confidence that an analyst had when they brought an investment forward? I felt that Josh's ability to generalize was stronger than the other members of the team, and that was probably a key differentiating factor.
So Josh, you go and take over CIO, and leading into this first investment committee meeting where Roz is now part of the committee, when you step into that seat, what are some of the things that you thought of either keeping the same and maybe doing a little bit differently?
So the most important thing I wanted to keep the same is that I would talk the least of my team. So our first investment committee meeting was something we do every 5 or 6 years called the strategic plan, or what most people would consider a base asset allocation review, and understand how we want to make some tweaks to the core asset allocation of the portfolio and how we want to think about what we might want to do differently. That was our first investment committee meeting with Roz on the other side of the table. And so the first day back in the office in 2024 without Roz, everyone knew this was our first project. So I divided the team up into 3 different analytical working groups, gave them some very general guiding questions, and said, let's find out what we all think about these 3 general guiding questions, and then we'll get together and start iterating from there. And the kind of things we had to adjust were, do we need to change our inflation assumption? Because as a foundation, our goal is to last into perpetuity. We have to pay out 5%. That's the IRS mandated payout. So our long-term performance objective is 5% plus inflation. Obviously, inflation had been a hot topic. Our baseline for the last 10 years, 12 years had been 2%. And the question was, should we bump it up? I let the team kick that around, and they came back and we brought that as one of the issues to the investment committee. But when I assigned the delivery of all these pieces for discussions in the committee, we spread the work out so everyone would have time to present and be seen by the investment committee, because I think that's an important skill set that everyone needs to eventually develop, and something that Roz had always given everyone on the team the opportunity to be front and center for 5 minutes and take questions from the committee. That's something that at least everyone in the Helmsley investment office relishes that opportunity. And I wanted to make sure that that did not change.
Inevitably, you might have slightly different views of managers than Roz did. And I'm curious where you thought of potentially making changes to the portfolio.
Well, I think it's really important to understand that new managers take a year or 2 to sort of emerge through our process. We don't have a need to make quick changes. And so we generally do a strategy review of, is there something we want to do that's come along that's new, or something we don't have that we want to investigate? And that can take 6 to 9 months to really get consensus on the team, whether we should start looking for a manager there. And then the manager search starts, and that can take 6 to 9 months. So it is a slow moving process. And so right off the bat, really, there was nothing that was changing at the margin. Roz had been part of all of our conversations for the last 18 months about some of these issues. And so I think there was no real concern about anything we were planning to do. And to be frank, we haven't proposed a new manager in the first 2 investment committee meetings because we've been focusing on the strategic plan. The other thing that was a big topic starting in 2022, when Roz introduced this idea of her retirement, was we'd gone from a zero rate interest rate environment for 12 years to a rapidly changing interest rate environment. And that in and of itself had cued everyone on the team. What's different? What are investment strategies we looked at 5 years ago that didn't work in zero interest rates and might work a lot better now? What do we own now that might not work as well in a 5% risk-free rate versus a 0% risk-free rate? And so those conversations had already been started when Roz was still there, and we're working through all of the discussions on the team about where to move. And so I don't think Roz just walking out of the building disrupted that slow pipeline. And so none of us felt like this was going to be something where Roz would be surprised or alarmed, where she would go, wait, you guys waited to do this because you knew I didn't like it until I left. There was never any chance of that kind of thing happening.
With all of this planning in advance, going back 5 years, previous 18 months, curious if there were any surprises once you took the helm.
I think the biggest surprise was, while I knew conceptually that managing people would be the largest use of my time, actually doing it and seeing it is a big change. It was something I was trying to be very, very deliberate about. I wanted to be the one who was talking at the end of a meeting instead of at the beginning of a meeting as much as possible, so that the organic nature of idea discussion was maintained. Coming from an investment background, sometimes it was hard for me to not be the first one to say, this is what I think. It's 3 times as important I don't do that when I'm running the department. Then the one thing I also really wanted to make sense that people could drop in on me whenever they had an issue. And so one thing I did is I blocked out the first hour and a half of every one of my days that are in the office. I called it office hours, and made a priority not to schedule things that conflicted with that, if at all possible, so that anyone felt like if they had something they wanted to just talk about for 5 minutes, they could come in and I would not be absorbed by something else. And while I have to say only about 10% of the time has someone used that office hours, every time it has happened, it's been an incredibly productive experience for both of us. So I really wanted to keep that open door feeling going, and this one sort of official way to do it really worked.
Even though you're very new to the seat, if you mapped out Roz's model at some point in time, you might have thought about your own retirement. And I'm curious, at what point in time do you project thinking about a transition plan for whenever it is that you're no longer in the seat?
Without being specific, I have 2 parameters. One is I have a goal of where I would really like Helmsley's asset base to be, or at least on a very strong path to that goal before I even considered what my timeline might be. I'm only 55, so there is a bit of a flexibility about where that would be. So those are really the only sort of things I'm thinking about at the moment. It's just too early to really even plan that. There is a tremendous amount of change going on in the markets. I think the environments are slowly returning to what I would call normal pre-financial crisis levels of investment scenario. There are obviously big adjustments happening as we speak, but I think there's an environment that will have impacts on how institutional portfolios are allocated. There's obviously been a massive bias toward highly illiquid, long-term private investing over the last 30 years. And I'm not sure that the current environment is as robust a scenario for that. And inheriting a portfolio or building with Roz a portfolio that's 40% in privates, that's something I want to be really deliberate about. What does it look like 10 years from now? If it needs to change, we have to start making those changes today in very gradual, incremental ways in order to get to where we want to go. You can't flip a switch in this business and change your portfolio asset allocation when 30, 40, 50% is in private equity.
How do you think about the hit by a bus risk that was originally what Roz started thinking about and mapping out well before it was really about when she was ready to retire?
The real benefit I've had inheriting a team that I actually interviewed every single one of them and onboarded every single one of them. So when I joined Helmsley in 2012, there were 2 other staff members in the investment office. Both of them moved on for their own reasons over the subsequent 5 years, and we built out the team to 10 investment professionals at the same time. So I feel like there is a lot of continuity and understanding about our team and what the trustees expect of us, how we do our jobs, what the governance rails are. And so if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, and the trustees did ask me that right away, I gave them a name, but it's something that's just there in case. The team as currently configured could manage the portfolio for a year or 2 while the trustees decided how they wanted to go with the next step. So I think the continuity that Roz built is still there and strong and is still supportive. But yeah, it's a disconcerting question to get in your 3rd month in the role, I have to say.
Having been through the successful transition of both of you, what advice you give to managers in your portfolio that you see either have mapped out or have not yet mapped out what you think is a viable transition plan?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question because we had a situation where one of Helmsley's managers lost its managing partner very suddenly, bike accident. And the question was, who'd take over? In that case, the situation was well managed because there was a deep bench behind the managing and founding partner. So there was somebody who could step in, the CIO, and he could do so seamlessly. He'd work closely with the managing partner, and there was unanimous consent behind that within the money management firm itself in the face of such a shock. So piece of advice number 1 is ask the question before it happens, because it can happen. So everybody should ask the question and formulate a well thought out answer. Step number 2 is it's never too late to start thinking about a transition. People should actively be managing a transition. That doesn't mean you have to announce it or telegraph it or brag about it or whatever. You could do it the way that I did it, very quietly, while you're working on determining who would be the best successor. I truly believe that promotions from within are the least disruptive. And that, to me, was the most important characteristic about the transition that was important to manage, especially seeing what had happened at some of the foundations and endowments in New York where there was disruption caused by the CIO leaving. In fact, Helmsley had to play defense, protecting our own team from being raided by these other foundations that suddenly were shorthanded staff because they didn't plan or manage their own transition.
So one thing that I've really been struck by talking to managers about this topic is there pretty much isn't a succession situation that hasn't happened that you can't think of. There's an example of hundreds of really badly handled situations and dozens of really well-handled situations. But despite that, when a manager experiences one of these things or has to confront it suddenly, there seems to be a real lack of awareness of what worked really well for someone else and what didn't work really well. I'm going to come up with my own answer all on my own. I find that attitude extremely surprising and frustrating, that managers don't think about this a little bit more proactively, but at least go out and say, who did this really, really well? Who did this really, really badly? Let me look at those 2 examples. Which train am I on right now? And how can I think about fixing it? But also, wow, I have an LP who has 100 other manager relationships. They've been investing in managers for 60, 70, 80 years. I don't know, maybe I'll go ask them. That thought almost never occurs to the managers. What would you guys like to see in concept? What is your experience about how your managers have dropped the ball or done it in a really elegant, efficient way? And I feel like there's so much concern about privacy or, I guess, containing control or spooking investors that a change is coming, that there seems to be a pretty deep-rooted reluctance on the part of managers to survey their best clients about what might be the best way forward. Just help me out here. The clients would love to help you because they don't want you to go in the wrong direction and create a problem.
Well, Roz, I want to ask you both a couple of quick closing questions. Before that, I feel like it'd be remiss not asking you to reflect on your 30-year career and maybe share some of the biggest lessons you've taken away as you've had time to step back.
When I think back about my career, I don't think about it in terms of legacy accomplishments per se. I think about it truly as lessons learned. And I realize probably the most important lesson is no one could stop me faster than I could stop myself. And that if I wanted to be successful, it was really important for me to get out of my own head and allow myself to pursue whatever it is that I wanted to pursue. Stop putting up gates in front of myself. The other thing, too, that I learned was pay attention to that tickle in your gut, because it probably means something really is going wrong. And the sooner you deal with it, the sooner you won't have to deal with it. I can't tell you how many people let something get wildly out of control because they ignore it, thinking it will go away. It rarely, if ever, goes away. There's so many lessons that I've learned. Probably the other most important lesson is that I didn't accomplish my 45-year career by myself. There were a lot of people who helped me along the way, and sometimes they weren't who you'd expect. Most people think in terms of, well, who was your most important mentor and who taught you the most? No, sometimes it was the guy in operations who put M&Ms on your desk because he knew you were having a bad day. And it was something like that that made all the difference in a world sometime. So recognizing people who you wouldn't normally recognize, but truly are helping you be better at what you're doing, even though it's not blatantly obvious. So being humble about the fact that I didn't get here by myself was another important lesson.
I'd like to ask you both two closing questions. Joshua, what is one fact that most people don't know about you?
Well, let's see. I've skied on a glacier. So I thought that was a pretty cool experience back in the mid-'80s, family ski trip in France in the Alps. And this one slope was literally on a glacier. And most of the time it was totally fogged in. And our guide said, well, let's go try. Maybe we'll get lucky. And we took the gondola up there. And as we got out of the gondola, literally the clouds parted, the bright sun came out, and the family had this amazing visual run underneath the peak of Mont 4, this glacier just running down into the valley. It was a pretty spectacular day and something I'll never forget. But just the soundbite, skied on a glacier, always resonated with me.
Roz?
Probably people assume that I'm really outgoing and that I like to be around people, and I am not shy. But the truth of the matter is, nothing makes me happier than if I can be home alone by myself with my dog.
Awesome. All right, Joshua, what's the best advice you've ever received?
I'm going to twist that a little bit on you. I think one thing that I've learned is that instead of giving advice, people respond better if you give them information. And so I guess that would be the thing that I would ever tell somebody is if someone comes to you for advice, don't tell them what to do. Help them get information that will let them decide on their own. Because it's very hard to just take someone's word and just do it, because you have biases that are built into your brain. And at some level, you already know what you're going to do no matter what anyone else tells you. And so I think the only way you're really going to make a better decision is if you have more information than what you started with. And so I don't know if I was ever told that or just realized that, but I think that would be one of the most important things I would say that I've been told or learned. Is seek information, not advice.
Roz?
Probably the best advice I ever got, that what we do is important, but it isn't brain surgery and the patient doesn't die. So have a sense of humor about what we do and recognize that we do get an opportunity to figure it out and change course and correct a mistake.
Roz, Joshua, thanks so much for sharing this great story of transition from one to the next.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, Ted. It was a real fun time.
Thanks for listening to the show. To learn more, hop on our website at capitalallocators.com, where you can join our mailing list, access past shows, learn about our gatherings, and sign up for premium content, including podcast transcripts, my investment portfolio, and a lot more. Have a good one, and see you next time.